Picture this. A 10-year-old boy stumbles through a Roman military camp, dressed in miniature soldiers' boots, charming hardened legionnaires who lovingly nicknamed him Caligula, Little Boots. Fast forward 27 years, and that same charming child would stand over the mutilated corpses of senators, forcing parents to watch their children die, and declaring himself a living god while his empire trembled in terror. This is not fiction. This is the true story of how Rome's most beloved prince became its most feared monster, transforming the eternal city into a nightmare of unimaginable cruelty, sexual depravity, and absolute madness. In just 4 short years, Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus Caligula would redefine the very meaning of tyranny, leaving scars on Roman society that would never fully heal. But how does an innocent child become a sadistic emperor who makes his horse a consul, forces senators to worship him as Jupiter, and turns his palace into a brothel where he personally selects victims for his twisted pleasures? The answer lies in a tale so shocking, so depraved, and so utterly insane that even Hollywood couldn't capture its full horror. The year was 37 CE, and Rome held its breath as Emperor Tiberius lay dying on the island of Capri. The empire needed a new leader, and all eyes turned to the young, charismatic Gaius, beloved grandson of the legendary Germanicus. Adored by the people, respected by the legions. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. Within months of taking power, the Golden Boy of Rome would reveal himself as something far more terrifying than his predecessor's paranoid cruelty or Augustus's calculating coldness. Caligula would become notorious for his incestuous relationships with his sisters, his unparalleled cruelty, and the madness that culminated in him naming his horse Roman consul while declaring himself a god. But this transformation didn't happen overnight. It was the culmination of a childhood steeped in violence, betrayal, and trauma that would forge one of history's most terrifying rulers. To understand the monster, we must first understand the boy. Born into the Julio-Claudian dynasty on August 31, 12 CE, Gaius was thrust into a world where family members routinely murdered each other for power, where paranoia was a survival skill, and where the line between divinity and depravity had long since been erased. His father Germanicus was Rome's golden general, beloved by all until his mysterious death, possibly by poison, when Caligula was just 7 years old. The trauma of losing his father would be only the beginning. Under the cold, calculating gaze of Emperor Tiberius, young Gaius learned that survival meant performance, that trust was a luxury that could kill you, and that power was the only protection against a world determined to destroy you. These lessons would serve him well as emperor and doom everyone else. The transformation began slowly, almost imperceptibly. When Tiberius died in March of 37 CE, Rome erupted in celebration. The old emperor had been increasingly paranoid and reclusive, ruling from his island fortress while Rome stagnated under his iron fist. The people yearned for a return to the glory days of Augustus, and in young Gaius, now 24 and devastatingly handsome, they saw their salvation. The early months of his reign seemed to confirm their hopes. Caligula paid generous bonuses to the Praetorian Guard, granted amnesty to political exiles, and put on spectacular games that dazzled the masses. He honored his beloved father Germanicus's memory and appeared to be everything Rome had dreamed of, a young, energetic emperor ready to restore the empire's greatness. But behind the public facade, something far more sinister was taking shape. Those closest to the emperor began to notice disturbing changes in his behavior. He would spend hours staring at his reflection, practicing expressions of divine authority. He began requiring senators to prostrate themselves before him, not as a gesture of respect, but as worship. Most unervingly, he started speaking to the statues of gods as if they were old friends, claiming they spoke back to him. The first real sign of trouble came during his recovery from a mysterious illness in late 37 CE. When he emerged from his sickbed, those who knew him best could see that something fundamental had changed. The charming young man was gone, replaced by someone or something far more dangerous. His eyes held a new coldness, his smile had acquired a predatory quality, and his voice carried an undertone of barely controlled violence. It was around this time that Caligula began implementing his first reforms. He started by executing those who had opposed his family during Tiberius's reign, but soon the executions expanded to include anyone who had ever slighted him, looked at him wrong, or simply failed to show sufficient enthusiasm for his rule. The death toll mounted slowly at first, then with increasing velocity as Caligula discovered that he genuinely enjoyed watching people die. But it wasn't just the killing that marked his descent into madness, it was the creativity he brought to it. Traditional Roman executions were swift and dignified, designed to maintain the social order while removing threats. Caligula's executions became elaborate performances, carefully choreographed to maximize both suffering and spectacle. He would force family members to watch each other die, parents to witness their children's torture, husbands to observe their wives' degradation. The transformation was complete when he began targeting his own family. His grandmother Antonia, who had helped raise him, was driven to suicide through his relentless psychological torture. His sisters, whom he claimed to love above all others, became both his victims and accomplices in increasingly disturbing scenarios that shocked even the jaded Roman elite. As 38 CE dawned, Rome began to understand the true horror of what they had unleashed. Caligula's palace, once a symbol of imperial dignity, was transformed into something that defied description. He turned his palace into a brothel, where he personally selected victims for his twisted pleasures, creating a nightmare world where Roman nobles' wives and daughters were forced to participate in orgies for the emperor's amusement. The emperor's sexual appetites knew no bounds or taboos. He openly engaged in incestuous relationships with all three of his sisters, but his treatment of Drusilla went beyond even Rome's flexible moral standards. He married his beloved sister Drusilla to Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, whom he had named as his heir, but when Drusilla died on June 19, 38 CE, Caligula was bereft and declared a period of compulsory, universal mourning. His grief took on dimensions that horrified even his closest supporters. Drusilla wasn't just mourned, she was deified, becoming the first mortal woman in Roman history to be declared a goddess of state. But Caligula's worship of his dead sister took forms that would make seasoned Roman soldiers vomit. He claimed she visited him in dreams, commanding him to acts that grew progressively more depraved. Her death seemed to shatter whatever remained of his sanity, unleashing appetites and cruelties that had previously been held in check. The palace corridors echoed with screams both day and night. Caligula had discovered that he possessed an almost supernatural ability to break human beings, to reduce proud Roman citizens to groveling animals begging for death. He would spend hours perfecting new forms of torture, consulting with executioners from across the empire to learn their techniques, then improving upon them with innovations that left even these hardened professionals nauseated. His sexual sadism became legendary throughout the empire. He would force senators to bring their wives and daughters to imperial banquets, where they would be subjected to public humiliation and worse. No one was safe, not the wealthy, not the powerful, not even those who had supported his rise to power. The emperor's lust was matched only by his creativity in finding new ways to degrade his victims. But perhaps most disturbing was how he began to merge his sexual perversions with his growing megalomania. He started requiring his victims to worship him during their degradation, to praise his divine nature while he destroyed them. He created elaborate ceremonies where Roman nobles were forced to participate in religious rites that were thinly disguised orgies, with Caligula himself playing the role of Jupiter, demanding divine honors while engaging in acts that would have shocked the actual gods. The transformation of the palace mirrored Caligula's own psychological deterioration. What had once been a place of stately imperial business became a carnival of horrors where the screams of the tortured mingled with the forced laughter of those desperate to avoid becoming the next victims. The very walls seemed to sweat fear, and even the emperor's closest allies began to sleep with daggers under their pillows. By 39 CE, Caligula had moved beyond mere sadism into territory that challenged the fundamental nature of reality itself. He declared himself a god, demanding divine honors from his subjects. But this wasn't the usual imperial cult worship that previous emperors had encouraged in the provinces. This was something far more personal and terrifying. The emperor began each day by conducting conversations with statues of Jupiter, Mars, and other gods, speaking to them as equals and often disagreeing with their advice. He would rage at Jupiter for not properly managing thunder, criticize Mars for allowing Roman defeats in distant battles, and lecture Venus on the proper conduct of love affairs. Palace staff, forced to witness these daily performances, began to understand that they were serving not just a tyrant, but something that had transcended human madness entirely. His megalomania culminated in him naming his horse Roman consul, but this act, while famous for its absurdity, was actually one of his lesser outrages. The horse, Incitatus, was given a marble table with ivory managers and purple blankets, and was said to dine on golden oats. But the real horror wasn't the elevation of an animal, it was what this act represented about Caligula's view of the Roman Senate and people. By making his horse a consul, Caligula was sending a clear message that he viewed the highest magistrates of Rome as less worthy than his livestock. But he went further, forcing senators to treat the horse with the respect due to a human consul, to bow before it and seek its counsel on matters of state. The psychological torture of watching Rome's most distinguished citizens prostrate themselves before an animal while Caligula laughed was almost more devastating than his physical brutalities. Caligula brutally murdered people for fun and used the law as an instrument of torture. He believed prisoners should feel a painful death and would kill his opponents slowly and painfully over hours or days. But calling them opponents misses the true horror. By this point in his reign, anyone could become a target for any reason or no reason at all. His victims included senators who failed to show sufficient enthusiasm during his speeches, citizens who reminded him of people he disliked, and even those who committed the crime of being too beautiful or too ugly for his current mood. He decapitated and strangled children, often forcing their parents to watch and applaud his divine justice. The emperor's definition of justice had become so warped that he would execute people for crimes they might commit in the future, based on dreams or omens that only he could interpret. He developed an elaborate system of tortures designed not just to cause pain, but to break the human spirit so completely that his victims would thank him for their deaths. Some he would keep alive for months, healing their wounds only to inflict new ones, creating living monuments to his absolute power over life and death. The terror reached its peak when Caligula began targeting entire families for destruction. He had discovered that killing one person was merely death, but destroying bloodlines was a form of immortal cruelty that would echo through generations. He would spare one family member to witness the destruction of all others, then release them to carry the story throughout the empire as a warning of his power. Rome itself began to change under Caligula's rule, transforming from the proud capital of civilization into something that resembled a vast concentration camp managed by a lunatic god. The streets that had once echoed with the confident voices of citizens conducting business now carried only whispers and fearful glances. People learned to walk with their eyes downcast, to speak in monotones that conveyed no emotion that might be misinterpreted as criticism or insufficient enthusiasm. The emperor's spies were everywhere, slaves reporting on their masters, children on their parents, wives on their husbands, Caligula had created a network of informants so comprehensive that Romans began to suspect their own thoughts might somehow be monitored. Paranoia became a survival skill, and those who failed to develop it quickly found themselves dragged to the palace for questioning that invariably ended in death. Public gatherings became exercises in collective terror. Caligula would attend theater performances and gladiatorial games not for entertainment, but to study the crowd for signs of insufficient worship. He had developed an uncanny ability to spot hesitation in applause, to detect the difference between genuine enthusiasm and fearful compliance. Those who failed his tests would be pointed out to his guards, who would drag them from the stands while the rest of the audience was forced to continue celebrating. The gladiatorial games themselves became increasingly bizarre and cruel under his influence. Not content with traditional combat, Caligula began forcing senators and wealthy citizens into the arena, sometimes armed only with wooden weapons against professional killers. He would place bets on how long they would survive, laughing delightedly when patrician blood soaked the sand. But it was his treatment of Rome's religious life that perhaps most clearly demonstrated his complete break from reality. He began appearing at temples throughout the city, demanding that priests acknowledge his divinity and rewrite sacred rituals to include his worship. When some priests resisted, he had them crucified within sight of their temples as a lesson to others. The emperor commissioned massive statues of himself to be placed in temples throughout the empire, often requiring that they be positioned so that worshippers would have to prostrate themselves before his image to reach the traditional gods. In some cases, he ordered that the heads of existing divine statues be removed and replaced with his own likeness, creating grotesque hybrid deities that perfectly captured the perversion of everything sacred under his rule. Rome's famous baths became places of terror rather than relaxation. Caligula would appear without warning, selecting bathers for immediate execution based on criteria only he understood. Sometimes it was for having scars that suggested military service he hadn't authorized, sometimes for possessing bodies that he found aesthetically displeasing, sometimes for no reason other than his momentary whim. The city's very architecture began to reflect his madness. He ordered the construction of massive bridges and buildings that served no purpose other than to demonstrate his ability to reshape reality according to his desires. Some were torn down before completion simply because he had changed his mind about their design. The waste was staggering, but the real purpose wasn't construction. It was the demonstration that he could command unlimited resources for projects that made no sense to anyone but him. Caligula's madness wasn't just psychological and social. It had devastating economic consequences that pushed the empire toward financial collapse. When he took power, Tiberius had left the imperial treasury full, the result of years of careful financial management and reluctance to spend on public works. Within 2 years, Caligula had not only emptied this massive reserve, but had driven the empire into severe debt. The money disappeared into projects that defied both logic and physics. He ordered the construction of a temporary bridge across the Bay of Naples, not for any practical purpose, but so that he could ride across it wearing the breastplate of Alexander the Great, demonstrating his divine power over the sea itself. The bridge consumed enormous resources and was used exactly once before being dismantled. His palace renovations consumed fortunes that could have fed entire provinces. He had rooms decorated with precious stones that were torn out and replaced when his aesthetic preferences shifted, sometimes within days of completion. He commissioned furniture made from materials so exotic that acquiring them required special expeditions to distant lands, only to have pieces destroyed when they failed to meet his impossible standards. The emperor's personal expenses reached levels that had never been seen before in human history. His wardrobe alone cost more than the annual budgets of entire provinces. He would order clothing made from materials that existed nowhere on Earth, requiring his craftsmen to invent new techniques and source impossible materials, then discard the results after wearing them once. But the real economic devastation came from his complete inability to understand the relationship between imperial finances and political stability. When the treasury ran low, his solution was simply to seize the property of wealthy Romans through increasingly transparent fabrications of treason charges. He would execute a senator for plotting against the emperor, confiscate his entire estate, then immediately spend the money on projects that served no purpose other than his momentary amusement. This policy of systematic theft created a vicious cycle that accelerated economic collapse. As wealthy Romans saw their peers destroyed and their property seized, they began moving their assets out of the empire or hiding them in ways that removed them from productive use. Trade declined as merchants feared that success would only make them targets for imperial seizure. The emperor's response to economic problems was to increase terror. He created new categories of treason that could be applied to anyone who possessed wealth he desired. Speaking unfavorably about imperial policy became a capital crime punishable by the forfeiture of all property. Failing to display sufficient enthusiasm for his projects was evidence of disloyalty worthy of death and confiscation. Perhaps most destructively, he began debasing the currency itself. Roman coins had been stable for generations, their silver content carefully maintained to ensure trust throughout the empire. Caligula ordered the production of coins with reduced silver content to stretch the available metal, but he was too impatient for gradual debasement. His coins were so obviously debased that merchants began refusing them, creating a crisis of confidence that rippled throughout the imperial economy. The provincial consequences were catastrophic. Regions that depended on imperial spending for their prosperity suddenly found themselves abandoned as resources were diverted to fund increasingly bizarre projects in Rome. Military pay became irregular, creating unrest among the legions that had been the foundation of imperial power. Caligula's relationship with Rome's military forces revealed yet another dimension of his madness: his complete inability to distinguish between the reality of warfare and his own grandiose fantasies. The legions that had conquered the known world found themselves serving an emperor who treated military campaigns like elaborate theatrical productions designed to showcase his divine nature. His first major military adventure was a campaign against the Germanic tribes across the Rhine. The expedition began with enormous fanfare and massive expenditures on equipment and supplies that emphasized spectacle over military effectiveness. Caligula commissioned armor and weapons decorated with precious metals and gems, more suited to parade grounds than battlefields. The campaign itself was a farce that would have been comical if it hadn't cost so many lives. Instead of engaging the enemy in traditional warfare, Caligula focused on staging elaborate ceremonies designed to intimidate the Germanic tribes through displays of divine power. He had massive portraits of himself erected in conquered territories, depicting him in the company of gods and demanding worship from defeated enemies. But the real disaster came when he attempted to prove his divine nature through military miracles. He ordered his soldiers to collect seashells from the beaches of Gaul, declaring them spoils of victory over Neptune that would be displayed in Rome as evidence of his conquest of the sea itself. Legionnaires who had spent their careers conquering actual enemies found themselves reduced to gathering shells, while their emperor praised their courage in defeating the ocean. His treatment of military discipline reflected his complete misunderstanding of what made Roman armies effective. He would promote soldiers based on their physical attractiveness or their willingness to participate in his sexual fantasies rather than their military competence. Competent officers found themselves demoted or executed for failing to show sufficient appreciation for his strategic genius, while incompetent favorites were elevated to crucial command positions. The emperor's personal behavior during military campaigns terrorized his own troops as much as it did the enemy. He would conduct surprise inspections where soldiers were executed for minor uniform violations or for failing to display adequate enthusiasm when he explained his strategic insights. He had officers flogged to death for questioning orders that made no military sense, creating an atmosphere where professional military advice became impossible. Perhaps most devastatingly, he began treating military victories as personal divine manifestations rather than the results of careful planning and soldier training. When his forces achieved successes despite his interference, he would attribute them to his own supernatural intervention, learning nothing about actual military leadership while becoming increasingly convinced of his invincibility. The long-term damage to Roman military effectiveness was severe. Career officers began requesting transfers to distant provinces to avoid serving directly under the emperor. The most competent commanders either retired early or found excuses to remain at frontier posts where they could minimize contact with imperial headquarters. Morale among common soldiers deteriorated as they realized their emperor viewed them as props in his personal drama rather than as professional warriors deserving of competent leadership. The traditional bond between emperor and army, which had been the foundation of imperial stability since Augustus, began to fracture under the strain of serving a leader who seemed to view military service as an extended theatrical performance. By late 40 CE, even those closest to Caligula had begun to understand that the emperor's madness posed an existential threat not just to individual lives, but to the survival of the Roman Empire itself. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite unit sworn to protect the emperor's person, found themselves in an impossible position. Their oaths bound them to defend a man whose actions were destroying everything they had sworn to protect. The conspiracy that would ultimately end Caligula's reign began to form among a small group of Praetorian officers who had witnessed too much to remain silent any longer. The group was led by Cassius Chaerea, a tribune of the Praetorian Guard, a career soldier whose military competence and personal integrity had somehow allowed him to survive the purges that had eliminated so many of his colleagues. Chaerea represented everything that Caligula despised about the old Roman military tradition. He was a professional who valued competence over theatricality, loyalty over personal advantage, and duty over self-preservation. He had watched the emperor's behavior with growing horror, but it was Caligula's systematic humiliation of the Praetorian Guard that finally pushed him beyond endurance. The emperor had begun treating his bodyguards as personal servants, forcing them to perform menial tasks that had nothing to do with security. He would require guards to clean his chambers while he engaged in sexual acts with various partners, to stand at attention while he tortured prisoners, to applaud his conversations with statues of gods. Most humiliating of all, he would mock their military traditions, suggesting that their scars and decorations were evidence of incompetence rather than valor. Chaerea himself had become a particular target of imperial mockery. Despite his distinguished military service, Caligula would publicly question his courage, assign him passwords that were sexual innuendos, and force him to participate in theatrical productions that made a mockery of everything he had spent his life defending. The final decision to act came when the conspirators realized that Caligula's behavior was escalating toward something that would make his previous atrocities seem restrained. He had begun planning expeditions that would have required the entire imperial treasury and possibly led to civil war with the provinces. His latest obsession involved moving the capital of the empire to Alexandria, where he planned to be worshipped as the pharaoh god of a new dynasty that would eclipse the achievements of the Caesars. Planning the assassination required extraordinary care. Caligula's paranoia had reached levels where he trusted almost no one, and his security measures were elaborate and unpredictable. He had taken to wearing armor under his clothes, varying his routes through the palace, and surrounding himself with guards whose loyalty he maintained through a combination of terror and bribery. The conspirators knew they would have only one opportunity. If they failed, not only would they die horribly, but Caligula's revenge against their families and associates would likely involve atrocities that would make his previous crimes seem merciful. The pressure of living with this knowledge while continuing to perform their duties as loyal guards pushed several of them close to psychological breaking points. The assassination finally took place on January 24, 41 CE, during a series of games held in the Palatine Games. The conspirators had chosen the location carefully. The narrow underground passages leading to the theater provided the perfect opportunity to isolate the emperor from most of his guards, while maintaining plausible reasons for their presence. The morning of January 24, 41 CE, began like any other day in Caligula's reign of terror. The emperor arose in his palace, conducted his usual conversations with the statues of gods, and prepared to attend the Palatine Games, theatrical performances that he had transformed into opportunities to demonstrate his divine authority over the Roman people. What Caligula didn't know was that this day had been carefully chosen by the conspirators for reasons that went beyond mere opportunity. The games would provide crowds large enough to create confusion after the assassination, multiple escape routes through the complex underground passages beneath the theater, and a legitimate reason for Praetorian officers to be positioned throughout the area. The emperor's behavior that morning showed no signs that he suspected anything unusual. If anything, he seemed more manic than usual, excitedly describing new tortures he planned to implement and discussing his latest architectural projects that would reshape Rome according to his divine vision. His guards maintained their usual expressions of respectful attention while internally preparing for what they knew would be the most important action of their lives. They stabbed him to death in his own palace, but the killing itself was almost anticlimactic compared to the 4 years of horror that had preceded it. When Charius struck the first blow, Caligula's reaction was one of genuine surprise, perhaps the first time in years that someone had done something he hadn't anticipated. The emperor who had terrorized the known world died quickly, his body pierced by multiple wounds as the conspirators ensured that there could be no possibility of survival. The man who had declared himself a god proved to be as mortal as his victims, bleeding and dying like any other human being despite his claims of divinity. But the conspirators' work wasn't finished with Caligula's death. Caligula's wife Caesonia and his daughter were also put to death, a grim necessity that reflected the Romans' understanding that the emperor's madness might have been hereditary and that leaving potential heirs alive would only invite future civil wars. The immediate aftermath of the assassination revealed just how completely Caligula's reign had terrorized Roman society. When news of his death spread through the palace, many of those present initially refused to believe it, assuming it was another of his elaborate tests designed to identify disloyal subjects. Others were so psychologically damaged by years of living under his rule that they continued to behave as if he were still alive and watching them. The Roman people's reaction to news of Caligula's death was complex and revealing. While many celebrated privately, few dared to show open joy, having learned too well the costs of displaying emotions that might be misinterpreted. The fear he had instilled was so deep that it took days for most Romans to accept that their nightmare was truly over. The Senate moved quickly to condemn Caligula's memory through the process of damnatio memoriae, ordering the destruction of his statues and the erasure of his name from public monuments. But the psychological and economic damage he had inflicted on the empire could not be erased so easily. Rome had learned that the imperial system, for all its strengths, was vulnerable to the madness of a single individual who could transform the greatest civilization in history into a charnel house of terror. He was succeeded as emperor by his uncle Claudius, who spent much of his reign attempting to repair the damage Caligula had inflicted on every aspect of Roman society. But some wounds proved impossible to heal completely, and the memory of those 4 years of terror would haunt the Roman Empire for generations. The economic recovery alone took decades. Caligula had not only emptied the treasury but had established precedents for imperial behavior that made wealthy Romans permanently suspicious of imperial intentions. Trust between the government and the governing class had been shattered in ways that affected everything from tax collection to military recruitment. The psychological damage was even more profound. Caligula had demonstrated that the imperial system contained no effective safeguards against a mad emperor. The Senate had proven powerless, the people had been reduced to terrified spectators, and even the Praetorian Guard had been forced to resort to assassination when their oaths of loyalty conflicted with their duty to preserve the state. Perhaps most significantly, Caligula had established templates for imperial cruelty that would be refined and employed by later emperors. His innovations in torture, his use of terror as a tool of government, and his systematic destruction of traditional Roman institutions created precedents that would echo through imperial history. Future tyrants would look back to his reign not as a cautionary tale, but as an instruction manual for absolute power. The religious implications of his reign were equally lasting. By declaring himself a living god and forcing Romans to participate in his worship, Caligula had corrupted the relationship between divine authority and earthly power in ways that would influence imperial ideology for centuries. The line between emperor worship and blasphemy had been redrawn in blood, and future rulers would struggle with the question of how much divinity they could claim without triggering another catastrophic backlash. Modern historians have debated the sources of Caligula's madness, proposing explanations ranging from inherited mental illness to brain damage from his childhood illness to the psychological effects of growing up in the murderous environment of the Julio-Claudian court. But perhaps the most chilling possibility is that his behavior represented not madness at all, but the logical endpoint of absolute power unconstrained by law, tradition, or human decency. The story of Caligula serves as a permanent warning about the fragility of civilization and the speed with which it can be destroyed by a single individual with unlimited authority. In just 4 years, he had transformed Rome from the proud capital of a stable empire into a city where citizens lived in constant terror, where human dignity was a luxury that could be revoked at any moment, and where the very concept of justice had been perverted beyond recognition. His reign stands as proof that no society, no matter how advanced or well-established, is immune to the devastating effects of unchecked power in the hands of someone who views other human beings as objects existing solely for their personal amusement. The Romans who celebrated his death had learned lessons about tyranny that they would never forget, lessons written in the blood of thousands of innocent victims. Thank you for watching Silent Atrocities. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want more absolutely insane historical content that your teachers were too polite to mention, hit that subscribe button right now, like, share, and comment below. See you in the next one.